This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 25 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Discussions at the Roundtable. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer. Today, Dr. David Rockstraw is joining me. Dr. Rockstraw is a Ph.D. chemical engineer and a Professor Emeritus at New Mexico State University. He's a sought-after expert in the field of chemical engineering, having been engaged for dozens of actions and as a consultant on a wide variety of topics. Dr. Rockstraw, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me, Noah. Please call me David as we go forward.
All right, David, it is. Let's jump into it. You've been on the chemical engineering path since your undergraduate at Purdue. Tell me a little bit about your background. Has chemical engineering always been a passion of yours?
Well, I grew up in Gary, Indiana. My father was a steel mill worker, which is a relatively polluted area of the country. So
Okay.
I've always had a passion for cleaning up the mess that I grew up in. And so chemical engineering was sort of a natural extension of my desire to live in a clean environment.
Oh, wow. That's a really lovely story. How is Gary these days? Has it gotten any better?
Yeah, I visited my mom last weekend while I was up there, and it's still not someplace I wish to live. Let's put it that way.
Sure, understood. You've also been an educator for over 25 years, so you moved to an education path. You worked for DuPont and several other companies and then moved into education. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I finished my Ph.D. at the University of Oklahoma in 1989, and I immediately went to work in the industry. I started with Ethel Corporation in Orangeburg, South Carolina, spent a year there, and then joined DuPont Conoco in Ponca City, Oklahoma. I had a wonderful job. I had a great experience in my time in the industry, but I found it exhausting, the fact that I was traveling, doing plant startups everywhere. And so the move to academia was more of a lifestyle decision to spend more time with my family.
I understand. So you worked for these companies for the better part of a decade. How did you turn all of that robust experience into a career as an expert? It looks like you've been engaged dozens of times as an expert. When was your very first call? How did it all begin?
Well, this is sort of interesting. I didn't even realize that the world of expert witnessing existed when I got started. I was in my second year as an assistant professor at New Mexico State University. Of course, the expectations of a tenure track faculty member are pretty demanding. I did spend a lot of time at the office and in the lab. The thing I liked about it is I went home every evening and I saw my family. I wasn't sequestered in a hotel somewhere. And so it was early evening, probably 6:00 p.m. I'm working on lectures, writing proposals, trying to get things done in my office. And an older gentleman walks in, sort of helps himself to my office, says, "Do you have a moment?" And I said, "Sure." And he sits down and he starts asking me questions about an explosion in a chemical plant up in northern New Mexico. And with my background in DuPont, I understood something about chemical processing, and I answered his questions, and he must have spent an hour explaining and then going through question and answer with me. And my mind was still focused on what I was trying to do. And so I guess I was thinking, when is this guy going to leave? I've got things I need to get done. And at the conclusion of our conversation, he says, "Would you be willing to say these things in a court of law?" Which sort of took me off guard because, as I noted, I didn't have a clue what expert witnessing was at the time. And
Right.
My first thought was, this is a community service request, and my wife would want me to do this community service. And so I couldn't tell the gentleman no. I said, "Sure, I guess I will." And we parted ways at that point, and I went back and I explained to my wife, and she said, "Well, you did a good thing. You're doing community service. That's great." And a few days later, he contacted me and asked me how much I charged, and that was the first point where I had any clue that this was even a job.
You thought you were going to be doing it for free.
I did. I thought it was a community service. And so I called my brother-in-law, who was a lawyer in California, to get his input on it. And he explained to me then what it was I had committed to do. And so that was 1997. It's been quite a few years now since I got started on this.
So how did you go from that to become this, expert witness juggernaut that you are now? Did they recommend you to the next person, or did you seek it out yourself?
Well, that was a long time ago, and at that point, I carried through with my commitment. I found that there was databases that maintained names and expertise of experts with companies that did matching. And so I started putting my name in some of the databases because I thought this was fun. I learned some new things. I got to do a little travel. I enjoyed the experience. And so I put my name in some databases. And then over the course of the next 20 years, one or two jobs came along every year. And I continued to perform, and I learned a lot as I went. And when COVID hit, the nature of education changed. And I really loved my job as a professor at New Mexico State University, but
Right.
the approach to it changed with COVID, and I was no longer interested in doing that. So I was retirement eligible. And so my wife and I had a discussion, and we decided we're going to go in this new direction. And so this became my focus now going forward.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's just very fortuitous. You're using a database kind of like we use LinkedIn now. You put yourself out there with your experience and your skill set.
Yeah, I think Russ and the Roundtable Group was actually one of the first. In fact, it was without a doubt the first database that I put my name into.
Well, then here we are, coming full circle. Let's talk about some of the more interesting cases. You've had a lot of them. You've worked on you sent me dozens of cases that you've worked on in the past, and I was reading them, and I have to ask, you've worked both for plaintiff and defendant side on numerous cases where a residential fire is attributed to spontaneous combustion. Is that something that happens a lot? Do I need to worry about my house exploding?
It's a phenomenon that happens associated with the application of stain products. Staining products, some of them oxidize and they generate heat as they oxidize. And if you don't handle your towels that you use to apply the stain properly at the conclusion of the job, they potentially could combust.
Kidding. So if you're putting some varnish onto something and you don't let it off gas, you get like some kind of exothermic reaction where it just burns your house down, huh?
Well, if you look at products that contain linseed oil and you read the instructions on how to treat the rags that you've used to apply the linseed oil, they will tell you to submerge the rags in a bucket of water and seal the top and take them out of the house. And so the cases that I've been involved in, the individuals applying the linseed oil did not follow those instructions, and they left the rags in the house in a heap, and that heap eventually led to the generation of heat, which caused the rags to combust.
Is a lot of your work products liability of that kind?
Yeah, I've done some of that, but most of the work that I'm doing these days involves intellectual property, either patent infringement, patent validity, or trade secret theft, and those are actually the cases I prefer.
Well, that's interesting. How are the different types of cases different? As an expert, how do you approach it differently from something like a product liability case to something that's more of an IP case?
Well, the IP cases are based strictly on science. And so you typically have a patent that defines exactly the bounds of what is covered. And so you're working in a very much more black and white area than with product liability or cases where someone's injured or loses their life. And I prefer that black and white.
Sure. When you're on one of these cases and you have to deal with the opposing counsel, are there any strategies that you use, or are you well prepared for cross-examination?
Yeah, the best strategy you can have for cross-examination is to be prepared. There's no substitute for spending as much time as it takes to become familiar with the document set, to understand both sides' approach to the case so that you understand how to answer the questions that they're going to ask you. And then your cross-examination can be contentious. And as an expert, you want to be calm. collected,
Mhm.
and not engage the opposing expert in any type of emotional interchange, because credibility and calmness seem to correlate. As soon as you lose your calm, you lose your credibility with the arbitration panel or the jury. And so maintaining calm and a smile on your face is the best thing you can do.
I know this might sound silly, but what's your strategy for that? Like, I'm sure that sometimes you want to get heated when somebody is saying something ridiculous or unscientific or upsetting. So how do you maintain your composure and keep your air of knowledge about you, without erupting?
Yeah, I don't know that there's strategy to it other than you just have to. You have
Right.
to sit in your chair, and you have to maintain that composure. And I'm not a guy that gets excited about things too often, so it's not particularly hard for me to do.
That's good.
Now, I recognize that as the opposing counsel loses his composure, it makes me even look more credible.
Right. That's absolutely the case. In any other cases besides the spontaneous combustion ones, specific cases that either had an interesting resolution or were just interesting as an expert, what are the parts of the cases that you enjoy? What are the interesting things that are going to happen to people who have only done one or two or haven't yet really entered into being, professional expert witnesses yet? What do they have to look forward to?
I really enjoy the cases that put me in the laboratory or put my hands on devices and have me doing research again. I worked on a case that involved a company named Ingevity for a patent that involved a product for removing fuel vapors from the air before they were discharged from the gas tank. So you have a gasoline tank, and as the temperature of the day goes up and down, the pressure in that gas tank goes up and down, and the vapors have to be vented. And they're vented through an activated carbon filter that absorbs the gasoline vapors and prevents them from entering the atmosphere. In this particular litigation, the plaintiff, Ingevity, owned a patent on this particular device that said this device will perform in the following way, given these particular characteristics. And so my job for a big portion of that case involved opening up a number of these devices, separating the activated carbon material from within the devices. So I had to use a Dremel and cut these large plastic containers open, collect the activated carbon, send it off for analysis, direct the analysis, direct the company that was doing the analysis on what I wanted done, collect the data, and then write a report based on the data. So it's almost like writing a Ph.D. dissertation. You're collecting the data, you're writing a report based on the data, and I really enjoy those hands-on cases. I just came back from 2 weeks up in Gurnee, Illinois, where I was doing the same thing. I was out in a plant collecting data for use in the litigation. So that's where my passion lies, is doing the hands-on work.
So that's it. When you get to use your expertise, that's what makes it fun. That's the part of it you enjoy. That's
correct. And you mentioned the spontaneous combustion cases. In one of those, I physically secured the product that was accused of causing spontaneous combustion. I applied it to some rags. I put those rags in a heap in the center of my garage, and I put a thermocouple in to demonstrate the heat increase, the heat rise that was caused by that particular product if you didn't treat the rags properly.
Wow. Oh, you had just mentioned the reports that you have to make. Let's talk about that. What are your strategies in making sure that the reports have everything that they need without anything that's superfluous to the facts at hand or to the case? What's your report writing strategy?
Well, this is where your interaction with the attorneys and counsel becomes very critical, because you want to understand very clearly what your role in the case as an expert is. Sometimes the cases are complicated, multi-pronged, and different experts have different responsibilities. So you need to know exactly what it is that you're there to testify to. You then rely on counsel to explain the legal status of the case to you. What are the laws that are being applied, and what are the bounds into which I need to express my opinions? And so report writing is pretty cut and dry. You've got an introduction, you talk about your background, you provide your opinions up front, and then you provide the support, and that format is used every time. But what goes into the report is very much guided by what the attorneys are attempting to prove or disprove in the case that you're involved in.
Along those lines, you've worked with a lot of different attorneys, so you've experienced being prepped by dozens of different attorneys. What are the things that work? What are the things that don't work? How can an attorney best prepare their expert witness?
Yeah. The cases that I've been most comfortable in are the ones where we spend lots of time. And so getting sequestered into a conference room with an attorney for 2, 3, 4, 5 days to do preparation is the best. In that case, not only do you practice your direct examination, the question and answers that you and the attorney are going to go through during direct exam, but then you can perform some mock cross-examinations where you talk about, here are the questions that the opposing counsel will ask you about, and here's how you should answer these to make sure that we preserve our case. And so doing that mock cross-examination is very helpful so that you know what's coming at you from the blind side. What doesn't work is short online prep sessions, and we sort of got forced into this during the pandemic, where we would have a Zoom session that would be an hour or two, and then they would say, okay, go study this for a few hours. It's not the same as being locked in a conference room with counsel where he's always there to answer questions. So as you're reviewing content, you say, what about this? What about that? Having someone there for that immediate feedback is very helpful.
Do you find the need to stay on top of a lot of current topics in your field to, when you're engaged in so many different states and sometimes even multiple countries? I can see that you've worked in Canada, or at least worked for a Canadian outfit before. Do you have to, obviously science is science and chemical engineering is chemical engineering, but is there a different body of knowledge that you have to find, that you have to quickly take in for each individual case, or is the experience that you already have enough?
Well, I've got a pretty broad expertise and background based on where I've come in life. And so I find that I'm well positioned to get started on many of these cases, but just with anything else, there's areas where I need to go improve my skills and climb a learning curve. And so I've become very good at teaching myself complicated material in a short period of time by going out and finding the appropriate resources to do that with. I spend a lot of time in the library.
Yeah, I bet as an engineer, that's where the information is, that in the lab, But hey, before we wrap up, there's one other thing I want to talk to you about, and it's time management. Of all the experts that I've interviewed, you have the most, the highest number of concurrent projects going on. How do you manage your time? You're doing consulting, you're doing education. Do you use any specific tools or software?
Well, I maintain a calendar, and I use that calendar to schedule things. When you start a new case, one of the first things, there's two things I want right off the bat from the attorney. I want a copy of the complaint so I can understand the legal basis for the lawsuit, and I want the court scheduling order so I can understand when reports are due, when depositions must be done, when the trial is supposed to start, and so I can patch these things into my calendar. Yeah, I've only been doing this as my primary form of employment for 2 years, so I'm still figuring things out. Not all cases work full speed all the time, so I've been fortunate to this point with all the cases that I'm juggling, that when one case picks up need for my time, another one seems to go into hibernation for a while. So I'm still hoping that they don't all start hitting me at the same time. But when they do, I get up early and I work late, and I give up my bike ride for the day.
Do you ever have the issue, working across different time zones where you need to be talking at somebody at 3 or 4 a.m.?
It happens pretty often, yes.
All right. Well, I'm not going to take up any more of your time, David, but thank you so much for joining me here today on Discussions at the Roundtable. Is there anything else you'd like to add to either attorneys or future experts that might be listening?
Well, for future expert witnesses, when you take on your first matter, spend a lot of time asking questions. There's a lot to know about the legal process that as scientists, you don't learn it during your formal education. And the more you know, the better you're going to be at it. And the one thing you have to remember is that your job is to find the truth, not to advocate for the client you represent. And so understanding that subtlety, and also understanding that when you're in deposition, your job is not to educate opposing counsel, it's to answer their questions. And so you don't want to get carried away with your responses. You just want to give the minimum answer you can to answer counsel's question. And those are some little things, but there's a lot more to be learned about the process. And so use counsel as a teacher to help you learn more as you go forward.
Wise words. Thanks again for joining me here today on Discussions at the Roundtable, David.
Thanks for having me, Noah.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Discussions at Roundtable. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com. Subscribe today on Apple Podcasts or your favorite listening apps.